Morning class, this is ECON 353 Microeconomics class. Today is March 31st, Thursday.
Today, the class will cover chapter 12 of your textbook, which is aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So far, we discussed the money market and goods and service market separately. Now, in this chapter, we are going to combine the two markets, the money market and goods and service market together so that we can get the aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And in the process, we are going to distinguish between the fiscal policy and monetary policy. And also, we are going to distinguish contractionary and expansionary policy, specifying the tools used in each case. And also, we are going to discuss how the crowding out effect occurs and explain the impact of interest sensitivity of investment on the effectiveness of a monetary policy. So here is the order of our video clip. Number 1, Fed's tools of a monetary policy. Number 2, the market for loanable funds and government policy. 3, deriving the aggregate demand curve. 4, movement along the aggregate demand curve. 5, shift in aggregate demand curve. And then 6, short-run aggregate supply curve. Here is the first video.
You've heard it said that Alan Greenspan is the most powerful man in the economy. What does that mean? How does the Federal Reserve exercise its power? To understand the way the Fed works, we have to begin by looking at the way banks work. Banks attract money from customers by offering them the convenience of easy withdrawal. That is, you put money into a bank, into a checking account, so that you can spend it when you go shopping. Now, checking accounts are important, and the Fed keeps tally on how many checking accounts are out there and how much money is in them, because this is an important part of the money supply. If you take checking accounts and you add them to the currency that's in circulation, you've got the money supply, M1. And the Fed watches that money supply, because if it gets too big, we could have inflation. If it gets too small, we might wind up with a recession. Again, people put their money into checking accounts because they like the convenience of taking it out when they want to write a check. But banks can attract money through other sources as well. They can offer savings deposits. They can offer you a certificate of deposit. They can offer you other accounts that pay higher rates of interest, because in order to get you to put money into one of these accounts, you've got to give up the convenience of being able to take it out exactly when you want to. Now, think about the way a bank makes a loan. When the bank makes a loan, which becomes an asset of the bank lends you money by giving you a checking account. You walk in, you say, I want to borrow money to build a house, and the bank doesn't just hand you a sack full of cash. They give you a checking account, and you can write checks out of that account. So when the bank makes a loan, they are creating checking accounts out of thin air. And banks might be tempted to create a whole lot of checking accounts because that's profitable. When you create one, you also get a loan, and that loan earns the bank interest. Well, here's the way the Fed keeps this process under control. If you're a bank, you can only create a certain number of checking accounts. And this ratio of checking accounts to your reserves is called the reserve requirement ratio, or the required reserve ratio. Now, what's a reserve, you might ask? A reserve is either cash that a bank keeps in its vault, or bank reserves that are on deposit at the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve Bank is the banker's bank, and when a bank makes a deposit at the Fed, that's called a reserve deposit. So by law, the bank has to maintain a ratio of cash in the vault and deposits at the Fed that is legal reserves. They have to keep a ratio of reserves to checking accounts of no more than 10%. That is, for every dollar you issue as a bank in checking liabilities, you've got to have 10 cents either in cash in your vault or on deposit at the Fed. Now, this then puts a constraint on banks. If banks want to offer more checking accounts, if they want to create more loans, if banks want to make more money, they've got to have reserves to do it. And this is where the Fed gets its power, because the Fed has the ability to control reserves. There are two things the Fed does. First of all, the Fed prints currency and can put it into circulation by buying and selling things. The next thing is, the Fed, being the banker's bank, can influence how many reserve accounts banks have to hold or are able to hold. Let's see how this works as we look at three policy tools of the Federal Reserve System. The three policy tools, the three ways that the Fed can influence the money supply are changing the reserve requirement, changing the discount rate, and finally, changing the amount of reserves available for business through open market operations. First, changing the reserve requirement. Suppose the bank says that instead of having to hold 10 cents in reserves for every dollar in checking, you only have to hold 5 cents in reserves. Well, suddenly, banks have got too much reserves. That is, they have excess reserves. And what banks will do in their pursuit of profit is immediately create more loans and create more checking accounts until the ratio comes to the legal requirement. So banks could almost double their checking accounts with their given reserves if the reserve requirement is cut in half. So when the Fed tells banks that it doesn't have to hold as many reserves, banks are free to make more loans and create more checking accounts, and that increases the money supply. If the Fed increases the reserve requirement, then banks have to call in loans and destroy checking accounts and shrink the money supply. Now, the second tool that the Fed has available to it is changes in the discount rate. And the discount rate influences the likelihood that a bank will borrow from the Fed. The discount rate is the rate that the Fed charges insured depository intermediaries, that is all depositories like banks, savings and loans, credit unions that have federal deposit insurance from the government. If you've got that insurance, then you can borrow money from the Fed. And the Fed charges you a very low interest rate, much lower than you could get if you went to the open market. But borrowing from the Fed is kind of like borrowing from your parents. You usually get a good deal on the interest rate, but you've got to answer a lot of nosy questions. Well, why do you need this money? And the next thing you know, the Fed is in your bank doing an audit. So banks tend not to borrow from the Fed if they can help it. And although this was the most important tool that the Fed used in its early days, nowadays it's relatively unimportant for the Fed's influencing the money supply. The third tool that the Fed uses is called open market operations. And open market operations influence the amount of reserves out there in the banking system directly. That is, the Fed buys and sells Treasury securities on the open market. Now think about this. If the Fed writes you a check for a Treasury bill, say you're selling a Treasury bill to the Fed writes you a check, you take that check to your bank and deposit it. The bank then presents the check to the Fed for payment, and the Fed can either give the bank cash or it can give the bank credit in its reserve account. Either way, your bank just wound up with more reserves, which gives it more room to create more checking accounts, and the money supply expands. So these are the three policy tools of the Fed: change the reserve requirement, make discount loans to banks, or open market operations. Now, open market operations are by far the most commonly used Federal Reserve policy tool. The Fed does open market operations every business day, increasing or decreasing the amount of bank reserves in pursuit of its policy goals. The reserve requirement is the least frequently used tool because it's the most powerful. Using the reserve requirement to try to fine-tune the economy is kind of like swatting a gnat with a sledgehammer. The reserve requirement has huge, far-reaching consequences. It has a kind of multiplier logic to it, and therefore any small change here can result in a big change in the money supply that's not easy to control. The Fed is most likely to change the reserve requirement during a period of rapid inflation or very deep recession. Finally, we've already talked about the discount rate. Banks borrow and lend with the Fed all the time, but less and less do banks borrow from the Fed if they can help it, because there are alternatives. They can borrow from each other, they can cash in their own securities on the open market. They just don't want to have to deal with the Fed's scrutiny. So more and more, the banks that actually borrow from the Fed are banks that are in trouble and can't get funds anywhere else. So it's a kind of emergency loan that usually involves a lot of scrutiny from the Fed itself. Right, so how do these tools work? Let's go back now and look at our map of the money market. Here's our map of the money market, the quantity of money and the price of money, which is the interest rate. The demand for money is represented on the red curve, and the blue curve shows us the Fed's supply of money that the Fed has determined in the market. If the Fed increases the money supply, then at the old interest rate, we're going to have an excess supply of money, and the interest rate will be bid down as people try to buy bonds with all this extra cash that the Fed has pumped into the system. As the price of bonds is bid up, the interest rate is going to fall. And as the interest rate falls, people decide that they're content to hold a larger fraction of their wealth in the form of cash. That is, as the interest rate falls, the quantity of money demanded increases. Well, how does the money supply actually in practice increase? It increases by one of three ways. First, the Fed lowers the reserve requirement. If it does that, banks can make more loans and create more checking accounts. The second thing would be banks borrow from the Fed. If the Fed makes the terms of borrowing easier, banks will borrow more. And when they borrow more, they have more reserves, and they can create more loans and more checking accounts. And finally, third, open market operations. Whenever people sell securities to the Fed gives people cash or checks, which they put in their banks, and when the banks present them for clearing with the Fed gives the banks reserves, which then gives the banks more room to create more loans and checking accounts. The Fed has the banking system on a leash, and think of the banking system as a hungry dog that's trying to get over there to get that big piece of red meat. What the Fed does is give the dog more leash by creating more reserves. And whenever the Fed creates more leash for the dog goes right for the meat. The banking system is going to expand to create as much money, as much checking accounts, as many loans as the Federal Reserve System will allow. That's how the Fed controls the money supply. By now you're wondering why we're spending so much time talking about savings and investment. Well, that's because it's at the very heart of the connection between the real economy of goods and services and the financial economy of money and interest-bearing assets. Let's go back and review the relationship one more time, because we've almost got a model together that's going to help us predict the interest rate and show us the connection between the interest rate and the real economy. Here's income and all of its uses. Here's aggregate expenditure adding up to income. Set income equal to income, do that algebra again, and you come up with this remarkable key equation, equilibrium expressed as the equality of investment and savings. Now, we've already talked about this side of the equation, that is investment spending, because when businesses are building factories, they're borrowing money, and the amount of money that they borrow depends to a large degree on the interest rate, the price of money. Now we're going to look at the other side of the equation, the supply of loanable funds. And the loanable funds are supplied when people save money and put it into the financial system. Households, the government, and foreigners. And it turns out that what influences people's decision to save money is also the real interest rate. So we've got demand, which depends on the interest rate, supply, which depends on the interest rate, and then we're going to put them together and find the equilibrium interest rate. That is the rate of interest that gives us an equality between the supply of loanable funds, that is savings, and the demand for loanable funds, that is investment. We're going to find the interest rate that makes this macroeconomic equilibrium happen. So let's go back over to our supply and demand diagram. And this time you'll notice I've changed the labels. The horizontal axis represents the supply of loanable funds. That's the money people put into the financial system. And they put it there because they're not spending it today, so we call it savings. On the vertical axis, we have the price of loanable funds, or the return that you get on your savings, the money that you have to be paid in order to put your money into the financial system. And as we've said before, what people really care about is the real rate of interest. That is, the return that they get on their savings measured in terms of purchasing power. I'm saving a pair of shoes today. What am I going to have next year? A pair of shoes and socks? More pairs of shoes? Or maybe only a cup of coffee? That's certainly going to influence my willingness to put money into the financial system. But as you'll recall, the real rate of interest is equal to the nominal rate of interest, what the bank pays, minus the rate of inflation. Therefore, if we hold the rate of inflation constant, the real rate of interest moves exactly 1-for-1 with the nominal rate of interest. So I can draw people's savings decision as a function of what the bank is paying them on their savings accounts. Now, let's think then about the behavior of savers. Whenever the nominal interest rate goes up, if inflation is constant, the real rate of return goes up also, which means that you can afford to buy more stuff than before if you save money today. The higher the nominal interest rate, the larger the return on your savings. And if inflation is constant, that means you can buy more and more stuff as the nominal interest rate rises. That means you're going to be willing to forego consumption. You're going to be willing to forego spending today in return for a larger amount of purchasing power tomorrow and next year and so on into the future. So what we have then is a supply curve that slopes upwards. The supply curve for loanable funds looks like this. That is, as the nominal interest rate rises, households are willing to forego consumption and put more of their purchasing power into the bank today in the form of savings. Now, households are only one component here of the savings. There's also the government, which is saving. If it's taking more in taxes than it's spending in government spending. There's also foreigners, and foreigners are saving if we are running a trade deficit. That is, foreigners are lending us money so that we can afford to buy more from them, importing more than we sell to them, exports. So if our net exports are negative, we're running a trade deficit, and foreigners are lending us the money that makes that possible. So the savings is the combination of foreigners saving in our economy, the government saving, and household saving. And in general, whenever the interest rate rises, the total quantity of loanable funds made available, supply, that is saved, is going to increase. Now, the next question is, what's going to cause this curve to shift? What would cause, for instance, at any given interest rate, the total quantity of loanable funds put in the financial system, the total amount of saving to increase? What would cause that to happen? Well, let's think about all the players whose behavior could lead to this shift. First of all, what would influence households to save more at any given interest rate? Suppose, first of all, people became fearful about the future and they decided that they needed to save more because they were afraid they might lose their jobs. Another thing that might happen is the government provide incentives to households to save more, like whenever you had the opportunity, beginning in the 80s, to have an individual retirement account or a 401k or a 403b. These government incentives encourage people to do more savings. Now, we can talk about a third thing, which would be change in the behavior of the government itself. Suppose the government runs a smaller deficit or a bigger surplus. That is, suppose the government reduces government spending and increases taxes. Now the government's saving more money. That is, it's taking more in revenue and it's spending less, so its savings is increasing. That's going to shift out the savings curve. At any given interest rate, total savings in the economy increases anytime the government runs a bigger surplus or a smaller deficit. A fourth thing that can happen here is a change in foreign behavior. Suppose the exchange rate changes and the cost of foreigners buying stuff from our economy changes. For instance, if the US dollar becomes weaker and the US dollar will buy less foreign goods than before, then people from the United States are less interested in importing. And when we're not interested in importing, then our trade deficit is going to shrink. Meanwhile, foreigners, seeing that goods and services in the U.S. are a bargain, will start buying more stuff from us. So our exports increase, our imports decrease, net exports are increasing, the trade deficit is shrinking, and foreigners are saving less money in our economy. On the other hand, if it happens in reverse, if the dollar appreciates, then we're going to find ourselves exporting less and importing more. The trade deficit increases, foreigners are lending us more money, and the savings curve shifts outwards at any given interest rate. So a bigger trade deficit shrinks out the savings curve, shifts out the savings curve. So here's the quick summary then of what can cause there to be more savings in our economy at any given real and nominal interest rate. And that is, first of all, a change in household behavior, perhaps due to incentives from the government or a fear of what could happen in the future and the desire to protect yourself with savings. Next, a change in government behavior. If the government runs a bigger surplus, it's saving more. If it runs a bigger deficit, then it's going to be reducing overall savings in the economy. And finally, a change in foreign behavior. If the trade deficit gets bigger, then foreigners are lending us more money. If our trade deficit gets smaller, then foreigners are lending us less money. So now we've got the behavior of borrowers and the behavior of lenders. We've got the supply curve for loanable funds and the demand curve for loanable funds. We've got savings and we've got investment. Now we're ready to put them together and find out how the change in the interest rate gives us an equilibrium. Suppose you're a policymaker during the Great Depression. The economy looks bad. Unemployment is high, banks have failed, and a lot of people are experiencing a big drop in their standard of living. People are afraid that things might get worse, and it's their instinct to save money. Now, as a policymaker, you've got two problems. The first is this increase in household savings going to improve the situation or make it worse? You've got to figure out what's going on and what might happen. The second problem is, how would you persuade people in your economy to act against their instinct if that was in fact the best thing for them to do? This is where a model comes in. A model takes all of the chaos of life and tries to cut through irrelevant facts to focus on the most salient features of a problem. Those things that really bear on what it is that you want to know and you want to control. A model does two things. First, it helps you understand the world better. And next, it acts as a teaching tool that can help you explain to someone else how cause and effect create a situation. We're going to begin now to build a model of the way the economy works. The thing we want to explain is the business cycle, the ups and downs of the economy. Recessions, booms, increases in unemployment, boom times where jobs are plentiful. And we'd like to understand how interest rates, prices, output, all that stuff fits together so that we know how a change in the economic environment, maybe a policy change like a tax cut, is going to affect all of these variables. Is it going to increase our standard of living? Is it going to make it worse? And who's going to benefit and who's going to be hurt? And we want this model to be simple and clear enough that with a little bit of investment of time and attention, someone else could learn it so that then you could have an intelligent conversation with other people about policies that might improve life for people in your economy. So let's think then about the business cycle and where it comes from. We begin with a notion of the flow of goods and services in our economy, a circular flow diagram that we've developed earlier. Households, businesses, the government, foreigners spend money on goods and services. And the money that businesses get becomes household income. And in equilibrium, this circular flow has to be such that spending equals income. That means any leakages from the circular flow, savings or taxes, has to be re-injected in the form of spending by government, businesses, or foreigners. Now, let's begin to build a model by thinking about the difference between the nominal economy and the real economy. The nominal economy is the world of prices and money. The real economy is the world of goods and services. The picture, as I've drawn here, is a picture of real flows, people actually spending on stuff, and everything in this picture is measured in terms of actual physical goods and services. That is, when you draw the circular flow diagram, you have held prices constant. I'm going to begin to build my macroeconomic model by asking, how will a change in the price level, an increase in the consumer price index, for instance, how will it affect the circular flow? How is it going to affect people's behavior and either expand or shrink the real economy? Suppose the price level goes up. Let's think about everyone in this picture who's going to be affected by that. First of all, households. Households have savings accounts, and these savings accounts are usually measured in nominal terms. That is, I've got $10,000 in the bank. When the price level goes up, my $10,000 will buy less. Therefore, I feel poorer. And because I feel poor, I may reduce my consumer spending. And when I reduce consumer spending, economic activity begins to shrink. Another thing that can happen is when the price level goes up, the money supply in the economy, the fixed amount of money that the Federal Reserve has printed and put into circulation, that fixed amount of money will now pay for less shopping because price tags are reflecting bigger numbers. So the fixed money supply now doesn't go nearly as far to doing your shopping, and people are scrambling to get more cash. The increased demand for money pushes up the interest rate and makes businesses less likely to spend. A second effect. A third effect is higher prices in our economy deter foreigners from buying our goods and services. They'd just as soon buy in another economy where prices haven't risen. So the effect on the exchange rate, that is the relative price of U.S. goods relative to goods abroad, then shows up with decreased foreign spending, once again shrinking economic activity. This is the beginning of a model, the price level and its influence on the real economy. We can summarize the effect of the price level on the real economy in a curve that we call the aggregate demand curve. The aggregate demand curve looks at aggregate expenditure as a function of the price level. Aggregate expenditure is the sum of all of the components of spending in the economy: consumer or household spending, business spending or investment, government spending, and foreign spending or net exports. Add all of these up and you get aggregate total spending in the economy, which in equilibrium is equal to income. Let's look at the aggregate demand curve, which shows aggregate planned spending as a function of the price level. And let's see how we can represent that. Well, we've already talked about how the relationship between the price level and income is going to be negative. That is, when the price level goes up, there are three channels through which higher prices lead people to want to spend less money. The first is households feel like they're poor because of the shrinking of their savings, purchasing power. The second is increased demand for money pushes up interest rates and deters business spending. And the third is that higher prices deter foreign spending as foreigners look for bargains in other countries. All of that says then that a higher price level leads to lower aggregate spending, which in equilibrium leads to a lower income level. Now, this is just the first step in the creation of a model that's going to help us predict when income is likely to increase, creating a boom, and when it's likely to fall, and what's likely to happen to employment and interest rates along the way. But this first step is important because what we're doing is identifying those factors that are likely to be important in building an explanation. And in this case, what we've said is the price level is important. The price level, a nominal variable, interacts with other nominal variables like savings and the money supply to influence people's behavior. And once real spending starts to change, there's going to be an effect on output in the economy and all of the other variables that depend on it. So now we're going to look in greater detail at this aggregate demand curve, what causes a movement along it, and what might cause a shift in it. We're building a model of the macroeconomy as we seek to explain the business cycle. And we've begun with the relationship between the aggregate price level and the real gross domestic product. Now, you'll recall that the equilibrium equation in macroeconomics is that income equals spending. That is, everything that's produced in the economy has got to be purchased by someone in equilibrium. So the real gross domestic product in equilibrium is the sum of spending by all of the agents who buy things. That is, consumer spending, business spending, the spending of government, and spending by foreigners, that is, our net exports. So what we're going to do now is look at the aggregate demand curve, a curve that we drew to explain the relationship between the aggregate price level and the real gross domestic product, and understand the story behind it. This aggregate demand curve is drawn to show that when the aggregate price level rises, the equilibrium real gross domestic product shrinks. That is, as the price level rises, consumers, businesses, foreigners, and the government buy less stuff. A movement along the aggregate demand curve means a reduction in real gross domestic product as the aggregate price level rises. But what's the story behind this curve? Why is it that rising price levels lead to shrinking real gross domestic product? Let's look now at the three stories behind this particular curve to answer the question, why does the aggregate demand curve slope downwards? The first story concerns consumer spending. How does a rising price level influence consumer spending? Well, think about it. When price levels are rising, that means the prices of all goods and services are going up together, along with your paycheck. But there are some aspects of your wealth that are fixed in nominal terms. Your savings account, for instance, your savings balance doesn't rise along with inflation. It stays fixed. And therefore, your real wealth actually shrinks. A given amount of money deposited in the bank will buy less after all prices have gone up. Now, the shrinking real wealth causes households then to feel poorer, and when they feel poorer, they reduce their consumer spending. Now that consumers are buying less stuff, businesses don't want to make as much stuff. Otherwise, they'll be stranded with a lot of excess inventory. So, a reduction in consumer spending leads to a reduction in factory output, and that means a shrinking real gross domestic product. So the first channel through which rising prices lead to a shrinking real gross domestic product is through the channel of real wealth and its effect on consumer spending. The second way in which rising price levels lead to shrinking real gross domestic product works through business spending. Investment spending is going to decrease whenever the price level rises. The story here is a little bit longer and involves a few more steps. When the price level goes up, everybody needs more cash and more money in their checking account to do their shopping because prices are higher. So what you see with the rising price level is an increase in demand for money. The increase in demand for money, however, is frustrated because the Fed hasn't increased the money supply. The rising price level increases the demand for money, but the supply of money is fixed. Therefore, the excess demand for money is resolved by a higher interest rate. The price of money goes up until people are content to hold the cash and checking balances that they have. Now, the rising interest rate has an effect on business spending. Businesses are not interested in doing as much purchase of capital goods whenever interest rates are high because finance charges are higher, and therefore investment spending falls. Now, businesses aren't buying as many capital goods, they're not building as many new factories, and they're not outfitting them with equipment. So because of the reduced demand for investment goods, businesses cut back their output of investment goods. And that means that real gross domestic product is going to shrink. So the second channel through which rising prices lead to shrinking real gross domestic product is the investment spending effect. Rising prices, increased demand for money, increasing interest rates, shrinking investment spending, and shrinking real gross domestic product. The third channel through which rising prices lead to shrinking real gross domestic product is through the effect on net exports. That is, when price levels rise, foreigners look at the price of goods and services in our economy and compare them with the prices of goods and services elsewhere. And they say, hey, it's no bargain to buy stuff from that economy anymore. Let's buy our goods from another country. So our net exports shrink as foreigners seek bargains in other countries. Since our net exports are falling, since people from abroad are no longer buying our goods and services but buying them from somewhere else instead, then our factories here see that there's less demand and they reduce their output. And real gross domestic product then shrinks. So the third effect is through the effect on net exports. Rising prices deter foreigners from buying our products, and when net exports shrink, real gross domestic product falls also. So there are three effects, and all three of these effects are summarized in the aggregate demand curve. The aggregate demand curve shows the relationship between the aggregate price level in our economy and our real gross domestic product. When the aggregate price level rises, there are three consequences. Consumers see their real wealth shrinking and they buy less. Businesses, because of the increased demand for money, see interest rates rising and they buy less. And foreigners see that our prices are high relative to the prices in other countries and they buy less. With all three of these reductions in demand, we get a reduction in real gross domestic product in our economy. That's why the aggregate demand curve slopes downwards. Now, that leads us to one final question, and this is often a point of confusion. How is the aggregate demand curve related to a demand curve from microeconomics? Suppose here we've got a demand curve like we draw in the microeconomics course. Maybe it's the demand curve for onions. On the vertical axis we have the price of onions, and on the horizontal axis we have the quantity of onions demanded. Think about what this curve is telling us. When the price of onions rises, people are willing and able to buy fewer onions. Therefore, the quantity demanded of onions decreases. The demand curve in microeconomics is about two effects, the substitution effect and the income effect. The substitution effect says that when the price of onions rises, onions aren't as interesting anymore because their opportunity cost has gone up. So you buy carrots or radishes instead. The income effect says when the price of onions goes up, then your purchasing power is shrinking, the purchasing power of your income, and therefore you buy fewer onions and less of everything else as well. That's the microeconomic story. It's about opportunity cost and purchasing power. The macroeconomic story, on the other hand, is different. On the vertical axis, we don't have the price of any particular good. We've got the aggregate price level, the prices of all goods and services, including your income. On the horizontal axis, we have the output, the overall output and demand in the economy. So what this curve is telling us is that as the overall price level goes up, the price of everything going up, that demand, overall demand in the economy is shrinking. And the story has nothing to do with opportunity cost. It has to do more with the relationship between the price level and other nominal variables. When the price level goes up, your savings account has less purchasing power. You feel less wealthy, and consumers respond to that. When the price level goes up, you want more money, another nominal stock in the economy. And since there isn't any more, then interest rates rise and businesses respond to that. Also, you can compare the price level in our economy with the price level in other economies, and foreigners respond to that. The issue with the macroeconomic demand curve is that the relationship between the overall price level and the overall output in the economy is because price levels influence the real value of other nominal variables, like the money stock or like savings accounts and other measures of wealth. So, don't confuse the microeconomic demand curve for onions with the macroeconomic demand curve that's talking about how the overall price level affects real gross domestic product. Now that we've got the aggregate demand curve drawn, and now that we understand what it means to move along it, we can talk about what shifts the aggregate demand curve. And this takes us one step closer to completing our model of the macroeconomy. We're building a model of the macroeconomy, and our goal is to be able to predict business cycles and explain how the economy will respond to changes in the environment. We've started with this aggregate demand curve, which is kind of the main axis of the model that we're building. The aggregate demand curve shows how total spending in the economy is related to the aggregate price level. And the aggregate price level influences total spending through three channels. First of all, rising prices shrink the real wealth of consumers and lead them to purchase less. Next, rising prices increase the demand for money, pushing up interest rates and leading businesses to spend less. And finally, rising prices cause our goods in our economy to be uncompetitive so that foreigners buy goods from other countries, shrinking net exports. The effect is that when prices rise, total spending falls, and that means equilibrium income in the economy, equilibrium spending is less. That's why the aggregate demand curve slopes downwards. Now, the next question is, what would cause this curve to shift? A shift in the aggregate demand curve means that there's more demand for goods and services in our economy at every price level. That means for any given price level, people want to buy more stuff, and so factories respond by producing more. Let's ask the question then, what would cause the aggregate demand curve to shift outward from this original curve, AD0, to this new curve, AD1? On AD1, the total spending in the economy is greater at any given price level. So here's the question you need to answer. What would cause people to spend more money if the price level didn't change? We know that rising price levels have the effect of shrinking total spending, but what would cause people to spend more at any given price level? The first answer is an increase in autonomous spending. Autonomous means stuff that's by itself, unto itself, not caused by something else. If consumers decided they just wanted to spend more money for the heck of it, they were feeling rich or confident about the future of the economy, then an increase in consumer spending at every price level would shift this curve outwards. More GDP because factories have to produce more to keep up with increased consumer demand. The second thing could be an increase in autonomous investment spending. If businesses are feeling confident, they may decide to spend more on factories, plant and equipment. If that's the case, at any given price level, we have a larger aggregate demand and businesses have to produce more to satisfy that. The same with foreigners. An increase in autonomous net exports comes about whenever foreigners decide they want more of our country's goods at every price level. So that's the first thing that shifts out the aggregate demand curve, an increase in autonomous spending from any of these components. The second set of things that can increase aggregate demand are related to policy variables. So let me list them then in order. The first of the policy variables is government spending. If the government decides that it wants to spend more, that is, if there's an increased amount of government spending on goods and services, that adds directly to aggregate demand at every price level. So if the government starts building more roads and bridges and spending money on schools and things like that, this increased government spending increases aggregate demand in the economy, so businesses have to respond to produce the stuff that the government wants. So that's one policy variable. It's autonomous. The government can increase its spending or decrease its spending anytime it wants. But when the government increases spending, we have an outward shift in aggregate demand. Another component that can shift the curve that's related to policy, a second one, is taxes. Now, taxes have the opposite effect, because when taxes go up, people have less disposable income, and therefore they're inclined to spend less. But when taxes fall, that's like giving extra income to consumers. And usually consumers will spend a big chunk of it, and that increases aggregate demand at any price level. So if the government wants to shift out the aggregate demand curve, if the government wants to increase aggregate demand, the government has two policy tools to use: government spending and taxes. An increase in government spending shifts the curve out, and a reduction in taxes shifts the aggregate demand curve out. The final policy variable that can shift out the aggregate demand curve is a change in the money supply. If the money supply increases, then interest rates are going to fall because there'll be excess supply of money at the original interest rate. The bidding mechanism pushes down the interest rate, and businesses respond by doing more business spending at any given price level. So an increase in the money supply shifts out the aggregate demand curve because of its direct effect on interest rates. So there you have it. That's what can shift the aggregate demand curve outwards. To shift the aggregate demand curve inwards, just reverse all of these stories. Decrease autonomous spending, reduce government spending, raise taxes, or shrink the money supply. So the outward and inward shift of the aggregate demand curve can just happen naturally because of changes in the behavior of the big spenders in the economy. Or it can happen by choice. A policy shift can move this curve. Now we'll see later why the government may want to change its spending, or why the Fed may want to change the money supply in order to calm the business cycle or stimulate the economy. But first, we'll need to expand our model by adding an aggregate supply curve. Then we can put supply and demand together and find an equilibrium price level for the economy and an equilibrium level of real gross domestic product. We're building a model of the macroeconomy because we want to explain the business cycle. We want to see what influences output and employment, and we'd also like to see if changes in policy could increase our standard of living. So, in an attempt to build a model, we started with an aggregate demand curve. This is the main axis of our model. It shows the relationship between the aggregate price level, that is the price of all goods and services taken together, and real gross domestic product, the output of the economy. Now, you might think that the next thing we're going to do is slap an aggregate supply curve in here and get an equilibrium. Wouldn't that be great? But we've run into a problem. And that is, while economists are pretty much in agreement about the aggregate demand curve, how spending works, the way that the price level is related to output on the supply side is controversial. In fact, there are all kinds of different theories about the aggregate supply curve. This is where economists are most likely to disagree. We start with a basic problem with aggregate supply and prices, and that's this: why should the aggregate price level affect the behavior of producers at all? After all, what producers really care about is profits, and profits depend upon their revenues and their costs. So, if the aggregate price level is rising, then the prices of all goods and services are rising together. That is, the price of final goods and services like cars and airplanes, and raw materials like steel and labor. Now, the price of your goods determines your revenue. If goods prices go up and sales remain constant, then revenue increases. The prices of raw materials and labor determine your costs. If the price of raw materials and labor rises, if wages go up and input prices rise, and your input quantities remain constant, then your costs are going to go up. And if revenues and costs are going up at the same rate, then your real profit isn't changed at all. And if your profit opportunities remain unchanged, then why would the firm change its behavior? Why would it increase or decrease its output? Now, in the long run, that is, after enough time has passed, an increase in the aggregate price level means that the prices of all these goods have increased together, whether it's the final goods or the inputs. But in the short run, that is, during the period of adjustment, labor prices may increase faster than raw material prices, and goods prices may increase faster than labor. That is, these prices are not going to move upward, adjusting in a constant, smooth rate. The adjustment is going to be jerky, kind of like traffic on a highway, and sometimes labor is going to pass raw materials, and sometimes goods prices are going to pull ahead of them all. It is this misalignment of prices, it is the difference in the rate of adjustment that creates opportunities for profit in the short run. That is, there is a period of time that may not persist very long, during which businesses can take advantage of the fact that goods prices are rising faster than labor or raw materials. One example would be if there are labor contracts that fix wages. And if the prices of goods go up when labor costs are fixed, then, well, there you have it, a profit opportunity, and firms are going to increase their output. Or what if raw materials prices were fixed by law or by some kind of agreement? Or what if the price of airline tickets rose relative to the price of automobile rides in the short run? People would do substitution, the way we describe in microeconomics. What I'm going to do now is use this insight that prices adjusting at different rates creates opportunity for profit. I'm going to use that insight to derive the short-run aggregate supply curve. The short-run aggregate supply curve shows the relationship between the aggregate price level and output in the economy in the short run. And the short run is going to be a period of time before all prices have reached their final adjustment. If I say that the price level goes up from, say, a level of 100 up to a level of, say, 110, if I say that the price level in the economy has increased by 10%, well, in the short run, the price of automobiles may be increasing faster, getting to that new target, than the price of labor. It takes a while for prices to adjust, and some prices adjust faster than others. Now, there are two stories I can tell you about the way in which prices adjust. And then the final story, which I will tell you later, involves labor contracts. The first story about the adjustment in prices is about confusion. Suppose you're an automobile manufacturer and you see that people are coming into your automobile dealership with more money to pay for cars. That is, they're offering to pay higher prices than before. The price of cars on your lot is being bid up. Well, in the short run, confusion is going to persist. You're not going to be sure whether there's just increased demand for automobiles or whether there's general economy-wide inflation. Maybe everybody's willing to pay more for everything because the money supply is increased or something. And the price of all things, that is automobiles, airplane rides, and labor, are rising together. In the short run, however, you're confused because you don't see the prices of these other things. And you have to act from your one observation, which is that the price of your good is going up. What you're going to do then is you're probably going to hedge your bets, imagining that there's at least a possibility that your profit opportunities have improved. And you'll respond by increasing your output from Y0 to a higher level of output, Y1. So an increase in the general price level can lead businesses to increase their output because of confusion. They're not sure whether it's increased demand for their individual product, which is a profit opportunity, or whether it's just economy-wide inflation, which is not a profit opportunity. But since they're uncertain, they respond anyway, and their response leads to an increase in real gross domestic product, and that gives us an upward sloping supply curve in the short run. The aggregate supply curve in the short run is upward sloping because of confusion. The second possibility is what we call the sticky price theory, or the sticky price explanation. The sticky price explanation says this, that when the general price level is rising, not all firms are going to be able to raise their prices immediately because it's costly to raise your prices. One cost might be the cost of printing a new menu. You want to raise your prices because demand is obviously strong. People are bringing in more cash to pay for your meals, but it's going to cost money to print new menus. So in the meantime, you leave the menu just like it is. Or in your grocery store, you may find that items are piling up on the shelves, but you don't want to go around and stamp them all right now. You want to see if this is going to persist because it's costly to adjust your prices. Or some businesses are afraid to raise their prices for fear of making their customers angry. Imagine what would happen then if the general price level is falling. That is, if the price level falls from 110 down to 100, and most businesses are quick to adjust their prices downwards, but some of them are slow because of the menu costs or because of some other cost of changing their prices. If that's the case, then these businesses that don't adjust their prices downward with the rest of the economy, they suddenly find that they're not competitive anymore. Their prices are too high, and therefore the demand for their products is going to be cut back. And as a result, they're going to reduce their output because no one wants to buy their stuff in the short run because of the high price. Now, in the long run, they'll eventually get their price down to the market, but in the short run, the cost of adjustment causes them to delay. And the cost is they sell less, and the consequence is they produce less. So I've just told you two reasons then why the short-run aggregate supply curve will slope upwards. One is because of confusion between demand for your product and general economy-wide inflation. And the second is because of the cost of adjustment, the sticky price problem. Next, we're going to look at how labor contracts can give us the same upward sloping aggregate supply curve in the short run. We've got an aggregate demand curve, and we're trying to come up with an aggregate supply curve so we can put the two together and get an equilibrium price level and output for the economy. But we've run into this problem, which is that if the price level rises, the price of goods, raw materials, and labor are rising together. Since business opportunities aren't changing when all prices rise together, why should businesses change their output? This has led us to ask the question, what in the short run could be happening? That is, during the price adjustment process, what could be happening that creates profit opportunities that leads business to change their output? We considered the possibility that there's confusion. It takes you a while to figure out whether the price of your good is changing relative to other goods or whether it's just general inflation. And businesses will respond during this period of confusion to what they think may be a profit opportunity. We've considered the problem of sticky prices. That is, it takes a while to adjust your prices because of the cost of printing a new menu or the fear of angering your customers. In that case, a profit opportunity is created in the short run as some businesses fall behind the price adjustment process and become uncompetitive. Now we're going to consider a third thing that can happen in the short run that can create a profit opportunity when the aggregate price level changes. And that third thing is fixed wages. Now, the classical view of the market is that wages and prices all adjust very quickly to make supply and demand equal to each other. In the classical view, the bidding mechanism quickly reestablishes equilibrium anytime something changes. So there is no profit opportunity created. All prices go right up and you're left right where you were before. In the view that we're going to discuss now, which is a Keynesian view, wages remain fixed in the short run. And when wages are fixed and the prices of goods increase, then there's a profit opportunity because the real wage that your factory is paying has shrunk. That is, the wage as a percentage of your revenue is getting smaller. So it looks like your profits are getting bigger because in fact they are. In that event, then, businesses are going to produce more output when the general price level rises because the price of their goods and services, their revenue, is rising faster than their costs because the wages are fixed. Now, before I go back to the aggregate supply curve, you're probably going to ask me, why would wages be fixed in the short run? Why is it that there's a period of time during which wages don't rise during a period of general inflation? And usually, rising wages are going to occur during periods of collective bargaining if the workers are unionized. So inflation occurs and the workers gather represented by their union and the union negotiates a higher nominal wage so that the workers can keep up with inflation. But then that wage is locked in for a period of 2 or 3 years. And if during that 2 or 3 year period there should be unexpectedly high inflation, prices increase faster than the workers expected, then the workers are going to find themselves at a disadvantage because they locked in a wage increase, but it was less than they would have needed to keep equal with inflation. So if there's an unexpected price increase, then the fact that wages are fixed works to the workers' disadvantage. So why would they put themselves in a position where that could happen? Because, think about it, workers accept fixed wages, and many of us accept fixed salaries as a kind of risk-sharing arrangement. I have an agreement with my employer that I get paid a fixed wage, whether I'm working harder during a period of high demand at my business, or whether I have more time to play computer games because demand is slack. But along the way, my wage remains fixed. I get paid about the average of what I add to my company's bottom line. I like that. It's better than my company paying me more in boom times and less in bust times, and then I'd have to go buy the insurance myself. So constant wages or fixed wages are a kind of insurance arrangement, and I like that, even if it means that sometimes the price level is going to be rising faster than my wages because I bought insurance. Another thing is the problem that as wages rise, sometimes workers actually want to work less. So businesses find a wage that encourages workers to be willing to supply labor rather than using their newfound wealth to buy leisure by taking more time off. We've also discussed elsewhere the phenomenon of efficiency wages, that there are reasons why employers wouldn't adjust wages over time because of the effect on workers' morale, workers' ability to buy health care and good nutrition, and the ability to attract high-quality workers. So there are a lot of factors in the labor market, including laws like minimum wage laws, union contracts, efficiency wages, and the desire for leisure that can cause wages to be less flexible than other prices. If wages are in fact sticky during a period of time, then it's possible that goods prices will rise faster than wages. And when they do, then you've got an opportunity for profit. And that opportunity for profit can be seen in the short-run aggregate supply curve. Here's a general increase in the price level, and when the price level increases generally and wages remain sticky, then the firm is now able to make more profit because revenue is rising faster than costs. Or another way to put it, real wages are shrinking. Wages as a percentage of the price of the company's product is shrinking. Therefore, the business sees that there's a profit opportunity and it expands output. Now, if wages are generally fixed across the economy, that is, they're sticky, they're not adjusting especially rapidly because of these concerns, then a general increase in the price level creates a broad opportunity across the market for firms to make profits by increasing their output, and that's precisely what they'll do. Now, in the long run, what happens is that workers go back to the negotiating table and ask for a higher wage that helps them keep up with the increase in the price level. But in the short run, if wages are fixed, then the businesses take advantage of the situation, they increase their output, and they make more profits. So now we've got three reasons why the short-run aggregate supply curve slopes upwards. Three reasons why a general increase in the price level leads businesses to produce more output. That is, confusion about relative prices, the cost of adjusting prices or sticky prices, and finally, the problem of fixed wages. In the classical view, there should be no relationship between the price level and output. But in the view that we've talked about, the more sophisticated view that tries to adapt some of Keynes's ideas to a modern way of thinking about the economy, there's clear reasons why increases in the price level in the short run lead to increases in the overall level of output. We've almost completed our model of the macroeconomy. We're almost ready to find the equilibrium price level and output and see how changes in the environment can generate a business cycle and what policy can do to encourage more output and growth. But what we need to add now is the long-run aggregate supply curve, a curve that answers the question, what is the relationship between the aggregate price level and output in the economy in the long run, after all prices have completed the process of adjustment? Recall that the process of adjustment may proceed in a jerky fashion. Goods prices may be rising faster than labor prices. Raw materials prices are rising at a different rate. But the long run is when all of those prices have completed their adjustment and the general price level in the economy has risen, say by 10%. Once all prices have risen by 10%, what would we expect businesses to do in response? Well, think about it. Businesses are out to make a profit, and profit is the difference between revenue and costs. Goods prices determine your revenue, materials and labor prices determine your costs. And if all of those prices rise at the same rate, there's been no change in the relative prices of output and inputs. There is no new opportunity for profit. You're back where you started. So, in the long run, after all prices have completed their adjustment, there's no new opportunity for profit. Businesses are back in the same position in which they started, and we would imagine that they would choose the same output level that they were choosing before. So in the long run, there's no relationship between the aggregate price level and the level of output. The long-run aggregate supply curve is a vertical line. So if we want to draw that vertical line in our diagram, the next question we have is, where does it go? Where should we put the long-run aggregate supply curve? Should it be over here, close to the axis, or out here, further away? The answer depends on how much output the economy can produce when all resources are fully employed. We're now going to define the concept of full employment output. Full employment output is the output of the economy when all resources are employed, perhaps all employed in their best uses. See, now we're starting to get into some fuzzy stuff because you can always work people harder, right? You can always go try to find more materials. But there's a notion of full employment output when everyone who wants to work is working as hard as they want, and all materials that are relatively inexpensive to get to have been employed, that nothing is being wasted. That's the idea. The output that we can produce when nothing is being wasted. You can always push the economy harder and try to make more, but that means paying people who don't want to work to come get a job, or climbing further up the mountain to cut down more trees. So the full employment level of output can be thought of as a kind of speed limit to the economy. This is the amount of output that we can produce when all resources are employed. If we go faster than the speed limit, then we run the risk of inflation, that is, pushing up prices. And if we go below the speed limit, then we've got unemployment, and the prices will tend to drop over time. Over time, wages will even tend to drop if there's unemployment in the labor market. So, the speed limit of the economy, full employment output, depends on two things. First, the resource pool. How much labor is there? How much raw materials do we have to work with in our economy? So if you combine labor and raw materials, these two things together determine the resource base of the economy. Next, what you want to, also another important resource is capital. I could put a hammer in this picture and we'd have all of our resources represented. The other important component that determines full employment output is technology. That is, our skill or ability to turn these resources into output. The better our technology, the more output we can produce with a given quantity of resources. So, take your resources and take your technology, put them together, and that determines full employment output. The output that's produced when all resources in the economy are fully employed. Think of that as a speed limit to the economy. You can go faster, you can go slower, but if you do, you're in a situation that's unstable. Prices are going to start to adjust, and other things are going to be, other changes set in motion. So let's go ahead then and draw our curve to represent the long-run aggregate supply curve. And here it is. It's a vertical curve, and I label it LRAS for long-run aggregate supply, and I'll call this 0 because this is my original one. And the long-run aggregate supply curve then represents the output of the economy when all resources are fully employed. In the long run, we're going to wind up back on this green curve. I've colored it green to remind us that the economy is constrained by the natural environment. All of our resources come from the natural environment, and that natural environment determines how much output we can produce, given our technology. So, now what we're ready to do is we're ready to put the short-run aggregate supply curve and the long-run aggregate supply curve together and find out what will cause them to shift. Before I put the short-run supply curve in this diagram, let's think about what would shift the long-run aggregate supply curve. What would change the speed limit of the economy? What would allow us to produce more output at any given price level? And the answer here is a change in our resource base or a change in technology. If we get more resources, say there is immigration of labor, more labor comes and joins our economy, now we can produce more output than we could before. Or if we get more raw materials in the economy, that's going to be an increase in our resource base. An increase in the resource base for a given technology shifts the long-run aggregate supply curve outwards. That is, it shifts here over to the right. If there should be a reduction in the resource base due to a war, then the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts inwards. Now, let's put the long-run and short-run aggregate supply curve together in one picture and see what happens. So let me go ahead and draw my short-run aggregate supply curve. And remember, the slope of the short-run aggregate supply curve reflects the impact that the price level has on output in the short run. When people are confused and when there are fixed wages and sticky prices, we get the short-run aggregate supply curve. So in the short run, we always have to be on the blue curve. If the price level is to increase, then in the short run, we're going to get an increase in output because people aren't sure whether it's just their sector or inflation across the economy. Also because wages are fixed, so businesses see a profit opportunity. Also because of sticky prices, there's going to be an increase in output as some people keep their prices low relative to the overall rising price level because of the cost of adjustment. So you're always going to be on the blue curve. But in the long run, you've got to be on the green curve as well. We'll see how we get there when we talk about the process of adjustment after we've put demand and supply together and found equilibrium. But we've got one more thing that we need to address, and that is what causes these curves to shift. Suppose there's an increase in resources in our economy due to immigration. What's going to happen then is the long-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift outwards, like we talked about before. And we're going to have a new long-run aggregate supply curve, and I can label that long-run aggregate supply curve 1. The level of full employment output in that case has increased. We've increased from YF0 to YF1. The new higher level of full employment output is due to an increase in the resource base. You'd get the same result if you had an improvement in technology. If technology were to improve, we would get an outward shift in the long-run aggregate supply curve. Notice that anytime you shift the long-run aggregate supply curve, it pulls the short-run aggregate supply curve with it. So the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts as well. So I can label this SRAS1. If the long-run aggregate supply curve were to shift inwards due to a war, it would also pull the short-run curve with it. So anything that shifts the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve along with it. It's as if they are attached right here at this point. Now, there's one more thing to consider, and that is that the short-run aggregate supply curve can change on its own power. That is, if we were to go back to our original set of curves, that is the long-run aggregate supply curve here and the short-run aggregate supply curve, then the short-run aggregate supply curve can change due to a change in expectations. This is the factor that can shift the short-run aggregate supply curve on its own. Suppose everyone, due to some change in the environment, decides that prices are actually falling. They expect a lower price level. What's going to start to happen is that workers, in order to remain competitive, will be willing to accept smaller wage increases. What happens also is that my business, trying to stay ahead of your business, is going to try to lower its prices first. Everybody, if they think that prices are falling, is going to move quickly to lower prices ahead of everyone else. What happens then when people expect lower prices is they build those expectations into their decisions, into their negotiations, into their wage contracts, and so forth. So that the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts downwards so that you can get a given level of output now at a lower price level. This is the one thing that shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve independently of the long-run aggregate supply curve, people's expectations about the price level. Once we start talking about the adjustment process, we'll see that the short-run aggregate supply curve frequently moves independently of the green curve, especially if you've created inflation by trying to go faster than the speed limit. But in the meantime, we can keep in mind a summary that says that anything that shifts the long-run aggregate supply curve pulls the short-run aggregate supply curve with it. And the factor that shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve independently of the long-run aggregate supply curve is people's expectation about the price level. Prices going down, if that's expected, the SRAS shifts down. If people are expecting inflation soon, they preempt it by pushing prices up now, shifting the SRAS up. So now we know what these curves mean, why they slope the way they do, and what can cause them to shift. We're ready now to introduce the aggregate demand curve and calculate an equilibrium. So we'll be doing that next.